answer to. I'll try to research it out. And there was something that I was a little fuzzy on, and I threw a slide on the back end of this presentation to address something I was a little fuzzy on that somebody had asked about in one of our past presentations. So we'll address that at the very end. So welcome. I'm glad that y'all are here, and we'll be having one more presentation after this one on the last sea day. I'll be talking about the Korean War at sea. So we'll be looking at the 1950 to 53 Korean War from the point of view of naval actions and offshore actions and what the naval services and coast guards were doing rather than primarily what the land forces were doing, which is usually how the subject gets approached. All right? In the 5 centuries since European explorers began discovering the subregions of Oceania known as Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, people have contemplated how these vast areas were originally settled and where their first peoples originated. Archaeologists, linguists, geneticists, and other scientists have increasingly brought their own skill sets and methodologies to examining how settlement of these widespread Pacific island groups occurred. Over just the last decade or so, in fact, such scientists have discovered evidence that has led to a number of compelling new ideas about exactly how, when, and by who this prehistoric migration took place. And we can see here Oceania and its 3 major subregions. Micronesia, the area of Oceania closest to Taiwan, encompasses some 2,100 islands, including the Caroline Islands, officially known as the Federated States of Micronesia and Palau, the Gilbert Islands, officially known as the Republic of Kiribati or Kiribati, the Mariana Islands and Guam, the Marshall Islands, and the island nation of Nauru. Micronesia has a total landmass of about 1,000 square miles within an area of ocean that is nearly 3,000 times as large, or about 2,900,000 square miles. And we note that to just give an idea of just how relatively small these specks of land in this vast body of water is. Melanesia, the area of Oceania closest to mainland Asia, is a subregion of Oceania that extends from the western end of the Pacific Ocean to the Arafura Sea and eastward to Fiji, that includes the countries of Vanuatu, the Solomon Islands, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. In addition to these independent countries, it also encompasses New Caledonia, a special collectivity of France, West Papua, which features 2 provinces of Indonesia, Papua and West Papua, and the Maluku Islands, the easternmost part of the Indonesian archipelago. Polynesia, the largest and most remote area of Oceania, encompasses more than 1,000 islands scattered throughout the Central and South Pacific, including the archipelagos of Hawaii and New Zealand, Easter Island, Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Niue, Wallis, and Futuna, and French Polynesia. Polynesia is probably also the culturally most diverse of the 3 areas we're looking at today, and likely the one to have been the most recently settled. So the one on which indigenous peoples have lived the least long. There are 3 broad sorts of prevailing but competing theories about the initial settlement of Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia that conflict over precisely where the early migrants originated, when they departed from their jumping off points, and how long it took them to reach the various areas of Oceania. We're going to first take a broad look at some of these groups of theories, and then we're going to take a somewhat closer look at some of the most recent research on the subject and how it either supports or undermines those ideas. All right? So, the slow boat model is the most commonly held traditional theory and one that many scientists still firmly believe today. So when most of us were growing up and learning about the settlement of Polynesia in particular, but Micronesia and Melanesia as well, we would have been given ideas in all likelihood that tied in with this slow boat theory of settlement. So this is what people have believed for the last century or so, and many scientists still believe it today. The slow boat model suggests that Melanesia was colonized first, between about 30,000 and 50,000 years ago. So people were crossing over, in many cases, on land bridges because sea levels were lower during the ice ages. And that humans reached Australia, New Guinea, and the Bismarck and Solomon Islands around the time that Neanderthals were still living in Europe. Descendants of such immigrants to Melanesia then also took to the seas over succeeding centuries and, continuing a multi-generational process of island hopping started by their ancestors, went on to colonize Micronesia and Polynesia. This model postulates that Polynesians and Micronesians had Melanesian ancestors and on their family trees, and that they are intertwined with them genetically, culturally, and linguistically. So that is the standard, most prevailing theory on this. A second group of migration theories, the entangled bank model, emphasizes the long history of Austronesian speakers' cultural and genetic interactions with indigenous island Southeast Asians and Melanesians along the way to becoming the first Polynesians. The third main model of Polynesian and Micronesian settlement, and the one that we're going to look at supporting studies for today predominantly, is the express train group of theories, which postulate a recent expansion out of Taiwan, starting around 3000 to 1000 BC, so pretty recent compared to these other theories, via the Philippines and eastern Indonesia, and from northwestern New Guinea onto already occupied Melanesia by roughly 1400 BC, reaching the western Polynesian islands right about 900 BC, which is when we have an idea that those islands were colonized, were originally settled. This theory is at this point in time supported by the majority of current new genetic, linguistic, and archaeological data, including a couple of interesting studies that we're going to look at today. So this express train theory of settlement is the one that the newest evidence is supporting. So, according to the latest genetic evidence, the ancestors of today's Polynesians and Micronesians were probably East Asians who quickly island hopped through near Oceania, or Melanesia, to include New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. This express train theory is also supported by growing amounts of linguistic and archaeological evidence, so 3 different streams of data. Between 3,000 and 3,500 years ago, this new migration, featuring an influx of peoples from Asia called the Lapita, followed in the wake of the much earlier colonization of Melanesia. So none of this express train theory says that the settlement of Melanesia is different than what was originally proposed. It's just saying that the people who went on to Polynesia weren't really Melanesians who continued onward. There were people who passed by Melanesia, as we'll see. Studies of genetics, pottery styles, and the shared family of Austronesian languages suggested that the Lapita's most likely origin was Taiwan and East Asia, but opinions differ over the history of these people. These Lapita were the ancestors of those who would go on to populate the most distant reaches of the Pacific and become known as Polynesians and Micronesians. Succeeding generations of these newcomers tended to arrive in Polynesia in small groups, and over a course of centuries, their populations became isolated in a way that few other people have anywhere in the world, as we know. And we can see here on our graphic possible migration routes, likely migration routes, taken by these people into the Polynesian Triangle there. This continues to be an area of ongoing research, and a number of relatively recent genetic, archaeological, and linguistic studies have begun to give us a clearer picture of migration patterns. Within just the last decade or so, for example, a researcher named Jonathan Friedlander, a professor emeritus of anthropology at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, has done research that strongly supports the express train model of expansion into Micronesia and Polynesia. He and his colleagues found, in fact, that modern-day Micronesians and Polynesians bear little genetic relation to the indigenous peoples of Melanesia. All right, so this was always the theory, that Polynesians are descended from Melanesians. But now these newer studies are showing that this does not appear to be the case. This supports theories that the original inhabitants of Micronesia and Polynesia are not descended from earlier settlers of Melanesia, but rather from East Asians and Aboriginal Taiwanese, who apparently raced through the region and did not linger in the islands of near Oceania. They left very few genes behind, Friedlander says, and they incorporated very few genes from the people in this region of near Oceania. Friedlander's study also reveals that Melanesian peoples demonstrate an incredible genetic diversity, evidence that suggests tens of thousands of years of relative isolation following a series of small migrations from Asia. So small groups came over, they spread throughout Melanesia, they became isolated over a period of thousands of years. There's more population divergence in these islands than you see across all of Europe, Friedlander said. You can really tell by the way people look and now genetically what island they are from. And we can see here on the left, by the way, a man from the Korowai tribe of New Guinea, and at right we can see a woman from Micronesia. Another researcher, an archaeologist named Patrick Kirch from the University of California in Berkeley, agrees with Friedlander's conclusions. It's what you'd expect over a long period of time like that, Kirch said. You see the same complexity in languages. New Guinea alone has something like 900 languages in its interior. That's probably the highest density of language differential per square mile in the world. Friedlander's study supports the idea that during the later migration of the Lapita, the colonists plied the waters in outrigger vessels and inhabited offshore islands and coastal areas not heavily populated with indigenous Melanesians. Maybe they were scared of going inland, Friedlander suggests. There were continuous feuding in this area, and it may have been a pretty dangerous thing to go inland. That fear of going inland, possibly based on the experiences of early groups of Lapita who fell afoul of the indigenous Melanesians, could go a long way toward accounting for why they kept moving and continued on to much more remote Micronesia and Polynesia, rather than settling in Melanesia where earlier migrants had. They weren't welcome and had to keep moving. Some interaction between the incoming Lapita and already present Melanesian peoples is evident. Lapita pottery, for instance, an example of which we could see here on the right, originated in Southeast Asia, but underwent distinct changes in near Oceania. Crops from Melanesia were adopted by the Lapita and carried to the far Pacific. Linguistic patterns also suggest some significant intermixing. The critical question for scientists is the extent of the commingling. A geneticist named Spencer Wells, a National Geographic Society explorer in residence and director of the Society's Genographic Project, thinks that the genetic data may show that Polynesians and Micronesians are a mix of Taiwanese Aborigines, East Asians, and Melanesians. I certainly don't think the data refute a slow boat model, he said. So we've thrown in his point of view because he is one of the stodgier old school scientists who really are holding to this slow boat model, possibly in the face of evidence that is suggesting that it isn't really viable. Wells pointed out that the mitochondrial DNA evidence, which is passed down from females, tends to support the express train theory. But the Y chromosome, or male, evidence supports a slow boat process. So one set of female genetics are suggesting one thing, male genetics are suggesting another. This suggests something interesting is going on, Wells said, perhaps with different male and female migration patterns, which we see in other regions of the world. So he's basically saying, well, to fit the genetic evidence to the reality, we're looking at males and females not necessarily traveling together from one area to another. Migrations being split up by gender. So that certainly is possible if you have military groups that are predominantly male going on ahead. But this is a postulation. Patrick Kirch of UC Berkeley, however, believes that Friedlander's genetic studies dovetail nicely with other evidence in favor of the express train theory. I think now the biological evidence comes in very strongly in line with the picture that we've seen in archaeology and in linguistics, Kirch said. Given that these are three independent lines of evidence and sources of data, that makes the theory stronger in my view. So he's saying that we've got these three separate types of information, archaeological, linguistic, and genetic, and they're all saying the same thing. That makes for a very compelling argument. And at left here, we can see a reconstruction of the bust of a Lapita woman. That's in the Museum of Ethnology in Osaka, Japan. And the large image in the middle is a glimpse of New Caledonia, the special collectivity of France and Melanesia that we mentioned before. Recent research into language evolution also suggests that most specific island populations originated in Taiwan around 2,500 years ago. So this bit of evidence that we're going to look at right now, this latest study, to me this is one of the most fascinating because this is really based on the least bootstrapping and the most real hard data, I think. In one of the most ambitious of such studies, scientists at the University of Auckland in New Zealand have used sophisticated computer analyses on vocabulary from 400 Austronesian languages to uncover how the Pacific was settled. According to Professor Russell Gray of the Department of Psychology at the University of Auckland, the Austronesian language family is one of the largest in the world, with 1,200 languages spread across the Pacific. The settlement of the Pacific is one of the most remarkable prehistoric human population expansions. By studying the basic vocabulary from these languages, such as words for animals, simple verbs, colors, and numbers, we can trace how these languages evolved. The relationship between these languages give us a detailed history of Pacific settlement. And we're seeing, at left, we can see a map of the Pacific and the language family tree showing the settlement of the Pacific by the Austronesian peoples. Pauses occurred before the settlement of the Philippines and before the settlement of West Polynesia, and this depicts how rapid expansion pulses occurred through the Philippines along the New Guinea coast in Micronesia and Polynesia, and at right, of course, we can see a map of Taiwan. Professor Gray's colleague, Dr. Alexei Drummond of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Auckland, so his colleague who worked with him on this project, explained some of the methodology employed in the study. Our results use cutting-edge computational methods derived from evolutionary biology on a large database of language data. By combining biological methods and linguistic data, we're able to investigate big-picture questions about human origins. Results of the University of Auckland study show how the settlement of the Pacific proceeded in a series of expansion pulses and settlement pauses. The Austronesians arose in Taiwan around 5,200 years ago. Before entering the Philippines, they paused for around 1,000 years and then spread rapidly across the more than 4,000 miles from the Philippines to Polynesia in less than 1,000 years. After settling Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga, the Austronesians paused again for another 1,000 years, probably reaching a critical mass of population during that period. So that's probably why we're getting these pauses up to a certain point, and then another pulse, before finally spreading into Polynesia, eventually reaching as far as New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island. All right, so these pauses and pulses. We can link these expansion pulses to the development of new technology, such as better canoes and social techniques to deal with the great distances between islands and Polynesia, said research fellow Simon Greenhall of the University of Auckland. Using these new techniques, the Austronesians and Polynesians were able to rapidly spread through the Pacific in one of the greatest human migrations ever. This suggests that technological advances have played a major role in the spread of people throughout the world. So as their technology improved, it allowed them to more quickly and efficiently cover these distances. This makes sense to us, but we look back and one sort of primitive boat looks the same as the next primitive boat, but there were actually technological advances that were allowing these expansions to proceed more quickly, and sociological constructs as well, as they noted. All right, so we're going to look at a different sort of genetic study at this point. I threw this in here just to show that it isn't just human genetics that are being examined as part of all this. Researchers at the University of Oxford in England have also used pig DNA to reconstruct the migration route of humans out of Asia and into the Pacific. And as we'll see, this possibly has some pitfalls. As other recent studies have shown, the evidence revealed by their work has shown that the story is more complex than long-held theories suggest, although its results are somewhat at odds with the genetic and linguistic studies done at Temple University and the University of Auckland. Based on their evidence, the scientists say that various pig domesticating cultures from Vietnam traveled south through the Malaysian peninsula into the Indonesian islands of Sumatra and Java and into the Lesser Sunda Islands. From there, the travelers reached New Guinea and then moved into Hawaii and French Polynesia. This route is in stark contrast to the theory that the first Pacific settlers originated in Taiwan and traveled through the Philippines to New Guinea and then further east. We know for certain that the pigs that are in the Pacific did not follow what's traditionally called the out of Taiwan route, said geneticist Gregor Larson, lead author of the study. Larson said his team looked in vain along the Taiwan-Philippines route for pigs with the same genetic signature as those that dominate in the Pacific. The pigs they found along that path in East Asian domestics, which Larson says were introduced to the region most recently. Larson suggests that if earlier travelers took that route, they did so without pigs. And of course, that's certainly possible. What it forces people immediately to say is, okay, the out of Taiwan model, though it may be true for humans, is certainly not true for pigs. All right? Pig genes contain a signature that tells exactly where the animals came from, said Larson. Because pigs were domesticated and carried with at least some of the first people to settle the Pacific, the swine are an easy and accessible way to track human migration secondhand. The irony here is that the best way to study humans is by studying what the humans took with them rather than the humans themselves, Larson said. His team therefore sampled DNA from 781 modern and ancient pig specimens to trace which types of pigs wound up where. The results suggest that one type of pig did disperse from South China, through Taiwan and the Philippines, and into the islands of the Western Pacific. But other, earlier dispersals of a different kind of pig took the southern route out of Vietnam. This pig became the dominant species in the Eastern Pacific. According to Larson, the findings support the theory that, instead of an entire language and culture migrating en masse from Taiwan, each component first came together in eastern Indonesia about 3,500 years ago. So he's suggesting sort of an interim model. The resulting cultural complex, known as the aforementioned Lapita, then spread as a unit to Fiji and Tonga. The Lapita were ancestors to the Polynesians who spread the culture to Hawaii, Tahiti, and other remote islands, Larson said. What's nice about the pigs is that there is a very strong argument for exactly that each one of these items is moving along a different trajectory, he said, until they reach New Guinea. If everything is considered one unit, but actually it's not, then the oversimplification can lead to a misinterpretation of what really happened. So he is seeing his pig data as making this more complex than a lot of the express train theory people. So by the admission of the pig researchers themselves, their studies do not necessarily support patterns of human migration, just those of domesticated animals carried by some of those people. And that seems to be the consensus of other contemporary researchers on the subject. According to our aforementioned Peter Bellwood, for example, an archaeologist, oh no, we didn't mention him before, an archaeologist at Australian National University in Canberra, archaeological and linguistic evidence make it clear that Pacific Island languages and the ancestral cultures associated with them originated in Taiwan and that they were not transmitted from Vietnam. He also thinks it odd that the two pig dispersals noted in the Oxford study did not have much overlap, as the various human populations transporting the pigs would have been in constant contact. And this in itself warrants caution before we reject the conclusions of careful multidisciplinary research that support the express train theory, Bellwood said. All right. So, a lot of very, very complex stuff, and I appreciate you all bearing with me. I find this all to be absolutely fascinating. And, you know, there may be a lot of us who, since we've been in school, haven't really contemplated, oh, how did these areas first come to be settled? But you see that this is something that a number of scientists are really very intent on trying to determine right now, and they are using all sorts of techniques that we would not have necessarily had available. There was no such thing as, you know, genetic information per se. That wasn't something that I heard a lot about when I was learning about these things in school. What is that all about, huh? Okay, I will take some questions about this presentation within the amount of time that I have available. I'm going to really quickly, though, go back to a couple of questions we had during our Pueblo crisis presentation and address them, because I got asked a couple of questions and I was a little fuzzy, and I don't like to leave things on a fuzzy note. So somebody had asked a couple of questions, or a couple of people had asked questions about the 50 caliber machine guns that were on the USS Pueblo. And how many people came to the Pueblo presentation? Okay, so about half the people in here. So this is somewhat relevant to at least half of you anyway. So we remember that the Pueblo was unable to defend itself because its 50 caliber machine guns were covered with cold weather tarpaulins, and all of its ammunition was below decks. And the 50 cal was kind of a difficult weapon to use anyway. And only one person on the entire Pueblo, a former Army soldier, actually knew how to use the 50 caliber properly. So there were a couple of questions, and I just wanted to clarify some things. First of all, I think I referred to the 50 caliber that was being used as an M1921. That's not correct. It's the M2. So I just wanted to clarify there is an M1921 50 caliber machine gun. But the standard issue weapon that was being used during the Korean War was an M2 Browning. And these pictures are kind of interesting. The one on the lower right is actually taken from the deck of the Pueblo in Pyongyang. So this is a picture taken recently, apparently by a tourist, a non-American tourist, who visited Pyongyang and visited the Pueblo. So that is one of the original 50 caliber machine guns on the Pueblo as it appears in its current berth as a museum ship right now. And then on the left, I included that because it actually shows what the 50 caliber machine gun would look like with an ammunition box attached to it. And then the other question was, is the 50 caliber still in use today? And the answer is yes. It's still widely in use today. It's essentially the same machine gun that was invented in 1918, but with a number of modification and updates to it. But it is still the same basic nomenclature. So, for example, Marines, U.S. Marines today, are using an M2HB. So the nomenclature has been updated to reflect the changes and improvements to the weapon. And then we also talked a little bit about why it was so difficult to put these weapons in to use, why it would take 10 minutes to get the 50 caliber machine guns ready to use, so that once the Pueblo was attacked, they weren't really useful. And the answer, I referred to calibration, how the weapons needed to be calibrated. That's a little bit vague. The correct answer is headspace and timing. Anyone here who knows firearms probably knows that most firearms have a fixed space between the base of a cartridge, base of the cartridge that goes in the weapon, and the bolt that carries the firing pin. It's just a fixed space. But in the 50 caliber machine gun, the M2 50 caliber machine gun, you have to adjust the head space. You have to adjust the space between the bolt and the cartridge. And if you don't adjust it properly, the weapon won't fire properly. So I don't know why it was designed that way. It's 1918 construction. But that made the weapon really slow and clunky to put into use. And then the other is timing. You have to adjust the headspace on the M250 caliber. You've also got to adjust the timing, which is is what affects its cyclical rate of fire. And that's got to be within a certain threshold, or it'll fire too quickly or too slowly, in which case it can jam or malfunction. All right? So I just wanted to clarify, 50 cal is still in use today. The M2 50 cal, Browning 50 cal, is still in use today, just in modified form, and that is why it was such a difficult weapon to put into operation. So when I say I'm going to research something out and make sure I get it right, I like to do that. So I don't know how much time we've got, but do we have any questions on today's presentation? Yes, sir.